1902 Funeral Photo Shows, Mourning, Until Someone Brightened the Widow's Face. The year was 1902, when photographs were not merely images captured in an instant, but methodical productions that required patience and precision. They were windows into moments long past, preserving memories in sepia tones that would outlive their subjects. And in this particular tale, a photograph would reveal far more than anyone was meant to see. Photography in 1902 was an art form steeped in chemistry and patience. The photographer, hidden beneath the black cloth drape of a large wooden camera, would prepare glass plates coated with light-sensitive emulsion, carefully timing exposures that could last several seconds. The subjects would remain perfectly still, holding their expressions like statues, their secrets captured in silver halide crystals that would later be developed in trays of chemical solutions under the dim red light of a darkroom. What emerged were not just pictures, but portents, frozen moments that sometimes revealed more than the eye could perceive in passing. In the small town of Blackwood Vale, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests that turned gold and crimson in the autumn light, stood the grand Thornfield estate. With its imposing stone facade, tall chimneys that punctured the skyline, and windows that gleamed like knowing eyes, Thornfield was both the crown jewel and dark heart of the community. The estate belonged to the Blackwood family, who had amassed their fortune in the textile industry during the previous century, building a mill that employed half the town and controlled the other half through loans and patronage. Their prominence in the community was unquestioned, their influence extending beyond the boundaries of their vast property, reaching into the town council, the police department, and even the church. It was a dreary October morning when the bells of St. Mary's Church tolled, announcing the funeral of Edmund Blackwood, the patriarch of the family. The skies were leaden, casting a somber shadow over the procession of black-clad mourners making their way to the cemetery. At the front walked Vivian Blackwood, Edmund's widow of 20 years, her face obscured by a heavy black veil, as was customary for widows of the time. The veil was more than mere fabric. It was a shroud of propriety, a physical manifestation of the Victorian ideals that still governed social behavior in 1902. A widow's veil was both protection and prison. It shielded her grief from public scrutiny, while enforcing the strict mourning protocols expected of her station. For a woman of Vivian Blackwood's position, mourning was not simply an emotional state but a performance, one with costumes and cues and an audience of townsfolk who would judge any deviation from the prescribed rituals of grief. The townsfolk watched in respectful silence as Vivian maintained her composure, her gloved hands clutching a handkerchief of fine lace embroidered with the Blackwood family crest. Behind her walked their son, Theodore, a young man of 19 with his father's broad shoulders and stern jaw, though lacking the kindness that had softened Edmund's features. Theodore walked with the measured steps of someone conscious of his new position, his black mourning suit impeccably tailored, his gold watch chain, a recent gift from his father, glinting despite the overcast sky. And beside him, Catherine, their daughter of 17, whose delicate features were stained with tears that she made no attempt to hide. Unlike her mother and brother, Catherine's grief was naked and honest, her slender shoulders shaking with each sob. She clutched a single white rose, her father's favorite flower, which she would later place upon his casket. The procession wound its way through the town, past the textile mill where the workers stood with caps removed, past the shops where business had been suspended out of respect, and finally to the cemetery where a freshly dug grave awaited the polished mahogany casket. As the casket was lowered into the ground, a photographer, positioned discreetly to one side, captured the moment with his large box camera. The flash of magnesium powder illuminated the scene for a brief second, freezing the mourners in their tableau of grief, or what appeared to be grief. But our story does not begin with Edmund Blackwood's death, nor with the solemn procession that followed. It begins 70 years later, in 1972, when a young photographer named Daniel Hayes stumbled upon a curious artifact while clearing out his recently deceased grandfather's attic in a house across town. The attic was a repository of decades, layers of the past stacked in boxes and trunks, covered in dust that danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the small dormer window. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and forgotten things. Daniel had been working for hours, sorting through his grandfather's possessions, separating what to keep from what to discard, when he came across a leather trunk tucked beneath the eaves. its brass fittings tarnished but intact. "Margaret, come look at this," Daniel called to his wife, who was sorting through old books downstairs. In his hands, he held a large envelope, yellowed with age, the paper crackling beneath his fingers as he carefully extracted its contents. Margaret's footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs as she made her way to the attic. She appeared in the doorway, wiping dust from her hands onto her jeans, her dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail. "What have you found now?" "Another collection of ancient receipts?" she asked with a smile. Daniel had been easily distracted throughout the day, fascinated by the ephemera of his grandfather's life, old train tickets, dance cards, letters from friends long gone. But this was different. Inside the envelope was a photograph, approximately 8 by 10 inches, mounted on stiff cardboard. It showed a funeral gathering, the mourners dressed in the fashion of the early 1900s. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Edmund Blackwood Funeral, October 17th, 1902. Photograph by Henry Hayes." "My grandfather took this," Daniel murmured as Margaret joined him, peering over his shoulder. "I never knew he was a photographer for the Blackwoods." Margaret studied the photograph, her brow furrowed. The Blackwoods? Wasn't that the family that owned the textile mill? The ones who built that big house that's now a museum? Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "Thornfield Estate. My mother used to tell stories about how grand it was, how the Blackwoods were practically royalty in this town." He pointed to the figure in the foreground. "That must be the widow, Vivian Blackwood." The photograph captured the solemn scene outside St. Mary's Church. In the foreground stood a woman in widow's weeds, her face barely visible beneath her veil, her posture rigid. Behind her, a group of mourners, their expressions varying from grief to what appeared to be merely obligatory solemnity. "I can barely make out their faces," Margaret said, squinting at the dark, underexposed image. "Your grandfather wasn't much of a photographer, was he?" Daniel chuckled. Photography was different back then. Long exposure times, primitive equipment. He turned the photograph over in his hands, studying the mounting board, the careful calligraphy of his grandfather's notation. "Still, I wonder if I could bring out more detail." "Always the perfectionist," Margaret teased, but her voice held affection. Daniel's dedication to his craft was one of the things she loved about him. His belief that with the right technique, the proper care, an image could reveal truths otherwise unseen. Daniel was a photographer for the local newspaper, and he had a darkroom set up in their basement. Over the next few days, he became obsessed with the photograph, using various techniques to enhance and brighten the image. It was more than professional curiosity. There was something about the photograph that called to him, a puzzle waiting to be solved. The basement darkroom was Daniel's sanctuary, a space where the outside world vanished, replaced by the gentle glow of a red safe light and the familiar sense of developer and fixer. Here, time moved differently, measured in the seconds of exposure, the minutes of development. Here, images revealed themselves slowly, like secrets whispering from the past. "I'm going to try a different developer solution," he told Margaret one evening, as he disappeared into the darkroom, a mug of coffee in one hand, the precious negative in the other. "I think I can bring out the faces more clearly." Margaret watched him go, a slight frown creasing her forehead. She had seen Daniel become absorbed in projects before, but there was something different this time, an intensity that bordered on obsession. Still, she said nothing, returning to her book as the basement door closed behind him. Hours later, Margaret was startled by Daniel's voice calling her name, a tremor evident in his usually calm demeanor. It was past midnight, and she had been dozing in an armchair, waiting for him to emerge from his darkroom cocoon. "Margaret, you need to see this." The urgency in his voice jolted her fully awake. She hurried down the basement stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath her feet. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying the acrid tang of photographic chemicals. When she entered the darkroom, she found Daniel staring at a print hanging from a line, dripping developer onto the floor. His face was pale, his eyes wide, transfixed by the image before him. The red safe light cast eerie shadows, making his expression seem almost haunted. "What is it?" she asked, moving closer. "Did you ruin the photograph?" "Look," he whispered, pointing to the image of the widow. "Look at her face." Margaret stepped closer, squinting in the dim red light. The print was still wet, glossy under the safe light, but the image was remarkably clearer than the original photograph. Daniel had worked his magic, coaxing detail from the shadows, bringing the past into sharper focus. and what emerged from those shadows made Margaret's breath catch. In the enhanced print, with the shadows lifted and the contrast adjusted, the widow's face was now clearly visible beneath the partially transparent veil, and what Margaret saw made her blood run cold. Vivian Blackwood was smiling, not the faint, sad smile of one remembering fond moments with the deceased, not the tremulous smile of someone trying to be brave in the face of loss. No, this was a smile of undisguised pleasure, of triumph. Her eyes, which Daniel had managed to bring out with remarkable clarity, sparkled with what could only be described as satisfaction. It was the expression of someone who had won a long-contested game, who had finally achieved a much-desired goal, and that goal, impossibly, terribly, seemed to be her husband's death. "That can't be right," Margaret whispered, unconsciously taking a step back from the photograph, as if its wrongness were contagious. No widow smiles like that at her husband's funeral. Not in 1902, not ever. Daniel shook his head slowly, his photographer's eyes studying every detail of the image he had created. "I double-checked everything. I tried different exposures, different chemicals. This isn't a mistake in the developing process. This is what was captured on the original negative." Margaret moved closer again, forcing herself to study the image more carefully. Maybe it's a trick of the light, or maybe she was thinking of something else in that moment, something that comforted her. But even as she offered these explanations, she knew they rang hollow. The expression on Vivian Blackwood's face was too clear, too definite to be misinterpreted. It was the look of someone who had gotten away with something terrible. They sat in the kitchen, the unsettling image before them, steam rising from their untouched cups of coffee. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking the passage of time as they stared at a moment from 70 years in the past. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky, but neither of them felt the exhaustion that should have accompanied a sleepless night. The more they studied the photograph, the more disturbing details emerged. The son, Theodore, standing directly behind his mother, had a similar expression, not one of grief, but of cold calculation. Only Catherine, slightly apart from her mother and brother, showed genuine tears, her young face contorted with what appeared to be true anguish. "There's something wrong about this," Daniel said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "The official story was that Edmund Blackwood died of heart failure. But what?" Margaret prompted when he didn't continue. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "I don't know. It just feels wrong. That's not the face of a grieving widow." He tapped his finger on the image of Vivian. "That's the face of someone who's gotten exactly what she wanted." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth. "You're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Daniel cut in. "But I want to know more about the Blackwoods, about Edmund's death." A new intensity had entered his voice, a determination that Margaret recognized all too well. "My grandfather was there. He took this photograph. He must have seen what I'm seeing now." "Daniel," Margaret said cautiously, "this was 70 years ago. Whatever happened, it's ancient history now." But Daniel wasn't listening. He was already formulating plans, questions, avenues of investigation. The photographer in him, trained to seek truth through images, couldn't let go of what he had discovered. A moment of honesty accidentally captured, preserved in silver and shadow for 7 decades, waiting for someone to truly see it. The following morning, Daniel visited the local library, where archives of the town newspaper were kept on microfilm. The library was housed in a Victorian building of red brick and arched windows, its interior a hushed sanctuary of knowledge that smelled of old books and furniture polish. The archive room was in the basement, a windowless space where time seemed suspended, where the past was stored in metal cabinets and accessed through machines that whirred and clicked. Daniel nodded to Mrs. Perkins, the elderly archivist who had assisted him many times in his research for newspaper articles. Her eyes brightened at the sight of a familiar face. "Daniel Hayes, what brings you to my domain today? Working on a feature for the paper?" "Something personal, actually," Daniel replied, keeping his voice low in deference to the library's atmosphere. "I'm looking for information about a family, the Blackwoods, specifically about Edmund Blackwood's death in 1902. Mrs. Perkins raised an eyebrow. "The Blackwoods? Now there's a name I haven't heard in years." "They were before my time, of course, but my mother used to talk about them." She led Daniel to a cabinet containing spools of microfilm organized by year. "October 1902, you said? Let's see what we can find." She showed him to a microfilm reader, a bulky machine with a screen and a crank that advanced the film. "You know how to use this, I assume?" Daniel nodded, thanking her, and settled in for what he knew would be hours of meticulous searching. He began his methodical search, starting with the household accounts from October 1902, the month of Edmund's death. "Edmund Blackwood, prominent industrialist, dies at 58, read the headline from October 15th, 1902. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the focus to better read the faded text. The article described how Blackwood had been found dead in his study by his wife, who had called for the doctor immediately. The cause was determined to be heart failure, a common enough occurrence for a man of his age and position, often under stress from business concerns. The piece went on to laud Edmund's contributions to the town, his generosity to charities, his fair treatment of workers at his mill, unusual for the time, and his patronage of the arts. A separate article 2 days later described the funeral, mentioning the dignified grief of Mrs. Blackwood and the somber presence of Theodore, who would be taking over his father's business interests despite his youth. Catherine was mentioned only in passing, as the daughter who was inconsolable. Nothing suspicious, nothing to indicate foul play. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the image of Vivian Blackwood's smile from his mind, that expression of triumph so at odds with the dignified grief described in the newspaper. He continued reading through subsequent editions, searching for any follow-up, any hint of controversy. But Edmund Blackwood's death seemed to have been accepted without question. A respected man who had died a natural death, mourned by his family and community. The perfect narrative, with no loose ends, except for that smile. He continued his research, digging deeper into the Blackwood family history. He discovered that 6 months after Edmund's death, Vivian had married his business partner, a man named Richard Holloway. The announcement was discreet, tucked away on the society page, noting that, in respect for the late Mr. Blackwood, the ceremony was private, attended only by immediate family. Theodore had taken over his father's position at the textile mill, despite his youth and inexperience. Subsequent articles hinted at changes in the mill's operations, longer hours, reduced wages, and the hiring of younger workers, including children as young as 10. There were vague references to labor unrest that had been swiftly resolved, though the details were suspiciously absent, and Catherine had been sent to a finishing school in Europe shortly after the funeral, where she had allegedly died of tuberculosis 2 years later. Her death warranted only a small announcement, without the elaborate obituary that would have been customary for a young woman of her social standing. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Edmund dies, Vivian remarries his business partner with unusual haste, Theodore implements harsh changes at the mill that Edmund would likely have opposed, and Catherine, the only family member who had shown genuine grief at the funeral, conveniently disappears to Europe and dies before she can return. Daniel made copies of the most relevant articles, his mind piecing together a narrative far different from the official one. By the time he left the library, the autumn sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square. He walked slowly, his thoughts 70 years in the past, seeing the modern storefronts and cars through a mental overlay of what the town must have been like in 1902. Horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps, women in long skirts and men in bowler hats. "It's all too convenient," Daniel told Margaret that evening as they sat in their living room. The copies of the newspaper articles spread out on the coffee table between them. Blackwood dies, the wife gets a new husband, the son gets control of the business, and the daughter, who might have been the only genuinely grieving person at that funeral, conveniently dies abroad. "You're suggesting they killed him?" Margaret asked, her voice hushed despite the fact they were alone in their home. She picked up one of the newspaper clippings, studying the grainy image of Thornfield Estate that accompanied an article about the Blackwood family's prominence in the community. "That's a serious accusation, even if everyone involved is long dead." Daniel paced the room, unable to sit still as his mind worked through the possibilities. The lamplight cast his shadow long against the wall, a restless specter. "I'm not accusing anyone yet," he replied, rubbing his temples. "But think about it. Vivian remarries Edmund's business partner just 6 months after his death. That's barely enough time to be out of deep mourning by the standards of that period. And then there's the smile in that photograph." He shook his head. "I want to know more. I need to find someone who might remember the Blackwoods, someone who was alive back then." Margaret set down the clipping and looked up at her husband, concern evident in her eyes. Daniel, this is becoming an obsession. Why does it matter now, after all this time? Daniel stopped pacing and met her gaze. Because the truth matters. Because if Edmund Blackwood was murdered, someone got away with it. Because history shouldn't be a lie. There was silence between them, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional passing car outside. Finally, Margaret sighed. So what's your next step? It's not like you can interview Edmund Blackwood. No, Daniel agreed, a new determination in his voice. But there might still be people alive who knew the family, people who worked at Thornfield or at the mill. He picked up one of the articles, which mentioned that Edmund had been 58 when he died. If he was that age in 1902, there could be people in their 90s now who knew him, who might remember things the newspapers never reported. Margaret could see that her husband's mind was made up. Whatever had begun with that photograph in the attic had taken hold of him, a mystery he couldn't leave unsolved. She knew that look, had seen it before when he was pursuing an important story for the newspaper. Daniel Hayes might have made his living as a photographer, but he had the soul of a detective, always searching for the truth behind the image. Just be careful, she said softly. Even old secrets can be dangerous if someone has worked hard to keep them buried. The following day, Daniel visited Meadowbrook Nursing Home, where several of the town's oldest residents lived. The building was modern, a contrast to the historic town surrounding it, all clean lines and large windows designed to let in maximum light. Inside, the atmosphere was a mixture of hospital efficiency and attempted hominess, with cheerful paintings on the walls and plants in the corners that couldn't quite disguise the underlying scent of antiseptic and age. Daniel had called ahead, explaining to the administrator that he was researching local history for a potential book, and was interested in speaking with residents who might remember the Blackwood family. The administrator had been surprisingly helpful, mentioning that one of their oldest residents, Eliza Foster, had worked at Thornfield Estate in her youth. Eliza's room was at the end of a long corridor, bright with afternoon sunlight streaming through a large window. Despite the warmth of the day, Eliza sat in a wheelchair by the window, with a blanket across her knees, her thin hands folded in her lap, her eyes clouded by cataracts, but still alert. Her white hair was arranged in a neat bun, and she wore a cardigan over her nightgown, as if even now in her 90s she maintained certain standards of propriety that had been instilled in her youth. When Daniel introduced himself and explained his interest in the Blackwoods, she motioned for him to come closer, a frail hand beckoning with surprising authority. "Haven't heard that name in years," she said, her voice a whisper that forced Daniel to lean in. It was a voice from another time, the cadences and inflections of a bygone era preserved like fossils in amber. Not many left who remember them now. Daniel pulled a chair close to her wheelchair, taking out a small notebook. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Mrs. Foster. I found a photograph of Edmund Blackwood's funeral," he explained. "My grandfather took it, Henry Hayes." Eliza's rheumy eyes widened slightly, a spark of recognition lighting their clouded depths. "Henry? Yes, I remember him. Quiet man, always watching. He had the photography studio on Elm Street." Daniel nodded, surprised and pleased that she remembered. "That's right. The studio is gone now, but my grandfather's house is still there. That's where I found the photograph." He hesitated, then asked, "Did you attend Edmund Blackwood's funeral?" Eliza shook her head, a small, careful movement. "Servants weren't invited to such things. We were expected to maintain the house, prepare for the reception afterward, but not to participate in the family's grief." Her mouth twisted slightly at the word grief, a subtle expression that Daniel didn't miss. "But I was at the house when they brought the news that he was dead." She paused, her gaze drifting to the window, to the past. Strangest thing, the mistress didn't cry, not one tear. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine, like a cold finger tracing his vertebrae. Here was the first external confirmation of what he had seen in the photograph, Vivian Blackwood's lack of grief. He tried to keep his voice casual, not wanting to lead the elderly woman. "Can you tell me more about Vivian Blackwood?" Eliza's fingers began to fidget with the blanket across her knees, plucking at a loose thread, a nervous gesture at odds with her otherwise composed demeanor. Beautiful woman, hair like polished mahogany, eyes that could freeze you where you stood. Cold as ice, that one. The master was besotted with her, but she lowered her voice even further, though they were alone in the room. She had eyes for Mr. Holloway. "Richard Holloway, Edmund's business partner?" Eliza nodded slowly, her eyes darting to the door as if even now, 70 years later, she feared being overheard gossiping about her former employers. They thought no one noticed, but servants see everything. The way they would look at each other when the master wasn't watching, the little touches of hands when passing in a corridor, the meetings in the garden after dark, when they thought the household was asleep. She leaned closer, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and age. I used to polish the silver in the parlor while they had tea. They never noticed me. Servants become like furniture, you know, just part of the room. I heard things. What kind of things? Plans. Whispers. Once I heard her say, "It's only a matter of time." And he replied, "Patience, my dear. These things cannot be rushed." This was 3 weeks before the master died. Eliza's face hardened at the memory, lines deepening around her mouth. I didn't understand then. Or perhaps I did, but was too afraid to speak. Daniel's heart was racing now, his suspicions taking more solid form with each of Eliza's revelations. And there were the arguments. She continued unprompted, her mind clearly back in the corridors of Thornfield Estate, between Edmund and Vivian, between the master and young Theodore. Terrible rows they had, in the months before the master died. Theodore wanted changes at the mill, wanted to cut wages, increase hours. The master refused, said he wouldn't treat his workers like slaves, that he remembered his own father working 16-hour days and coming home with hands bleeding from the machines. Eliza's face hardened at the memory. After the master died, Theodore got his way. People suffered. Children as young as 8 working dangerous jobs, men and women collapsing from exhaustion, injuries that were never compensated. Her voice cracked slightly. My own brother lost 2 fingers in one of those machines. No compensation, no job afterward. Theodore Blackwood said he was careless and deserved what he got. Daniel took out a small notebook and jotted down these details, his hand moving quickly across the page. Each piece of information was another brushstroke in a portrait of a family driven by greed and ambition, willing to remove anyone who stood in their way, even the patriarch himself. And Catherine? What can you tell me about her? At the mention of Catherine's name, Eliza's eyes filled with tears, a surprising show of emotion from a woman who had recounted the suffering of her own brother with stoic resignation. Sweet child, she loved her father dearly, not at all like her mother or brother. She would sit with him in his study for hours, reading poetry aloud while he worked on his accounts. She had his kindness, his sense of justice. He used to smuggle food from the kitchen to give to the mill workers' families when they were in need. The old woman shook her head. She was the only one who truly mourned him. The old woman's hand suddenly shot out, gripping Daniel's wrist with surprising strength. Her fingers were like twigs, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but the desperation in her grip was unmistakable. She knew. Knew what? Daniel asked, though he already suspected the answer. That her father's death wasn't natural. I heard her arguing with her mother the night after the funeral. I was turning down the beds. The mistress's room was across the hall from Catherine's. The door wasn't fully closed. I heard Catherine accusing her of terrible things. Daniel's heart raced, his journalist's instinct for a story now fully engaged. Do you believe Edmund Blackwood was murdered? Eliza released his wrist and sank back into her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 94 years. The brief burst of animation that had come with recounting her memories seemed to drain from her, leaving her deflated, a fragile husk of the young maid who had once moved silently through the grand halls of Thornfield Estate, watching and listening. It wasn't my place to question such things. Servants didn't speak against their masters, not if they wanted to keep their positions. And positions were hard to come by for girls like me, with no education and a family to help support. She shook her head, regret etching deeper lines in her ancient face. But I remember the night he died. I was polishing silver in the dining room when I heard the mistress go into his study. There was talking, then shouting, then silence. She shook her head. The next thing I knew, she was calling for help, saying the master had collapsed. The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Daniel leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. Did anyone suspect foul play at the time? The doctor was a friend of the family. Dr. Collins, I believe his name was. He didn't ask questions, just examined the body briefly and signed whatever documents were necessary. Her voice took on a bitter edge. And Mr. Holloway, he made sure any rumors were quickly silenced. He owned the newspaper by then, you see, and had friends in the police department. A word here, a threat there. It was enough to ensure that no one looked too closely at how Edmund Blackwood had died. Daniel made a note to look up Dr. Collins, wondering if he might still be alive. or if he had left any records that might shed light on Edmund's death. What about Catherine? You said she confronted her mother about her suspicions. What happened to her afterward? They sent her away, supposedly to a finishing school in Switzerland. Very sudden it was. One day she was there, the next gone, with barely a goodbye to anyone. Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. She wrote to me once. A letter smuggled back with a delivery driver who had taken her to the train station. Said she was afraid, that she didn't want to go but had no choice. That was the last I ever heard from her directly. Daniel thanked Eliza for her time, promising to return. But as he turned to leave, she called out to him, her voice suddenly stronger, more urgent. There's something else, she said. Something I've never told anyone. Daniel waited as Eliza gathered her thoughts, her ancient face contorted with the effort of retrieving a memory buried for 7 decades. The room was quiet, except for the faint sounds of the nursing home beyond the door. A distant television, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, a medication cart being wheeled down the corridor. The night before Catherine left for Europe, she came to my quarters. It was past midnight and she was in her nightgown, her hair loose down her back like a child's. I'd never seen her look so frightened. Eliza's voice trembled with the memory. She gave me something for safekeeping. Said if anything happened to her, I should show it to the authorities. Eliza's voice quavered. It was a small vial. She said it contained the same poison that had killed her father. What did you do with it? Daniel asked, his voice barely audible, not trusting himself to speak louder, for fear of breaking the spell of Eliza's recollections. I kept it hidden, as she asked, in a hollow book on my shelf. Jane Eyre it was. Catherine had given it to me as a Christmas gift the year before. Eliza's gaze drifted to the window, where the afternoon light was beginning to fade, shadows lengthening across the grounds of the nursing home. But then news came of her death, and I was too afraid. The mistress and Mr. Holloway, they had such power in those days. Money to buy influence, secrets to ensure cooperation. And Theodore, she shuddered, a tremor running through her frail body. He was worse than either of them. Had a cruel streak, that boy. Enjoyed seeing others afraid. So I buried the vial in the garden, beneath the white rose bush that Catherine had planted when she was 12. Her secret place, she called it. She would go there to read or just to think, away from her mother's critical eye. I don't know if it's still there after all these years. Eliza looked up at Daniel, her clouded eyes suddenly piercing in their intensity. I've carried this secret for so long, never told a soul. Not even when I left service at Thornfield. Not even after all the Blackwoods were gone. Some habits are hard to break, and servants learn early to keep their master's secrets. She reached out and took Daniel's hand, her skin like parchment against his. But I'm old now. So old. And soon I'll have to answer to a higher authority than the Blackwoods. I don't want to carry this with me to the grave. Daniel squeezed her hand gently, moved by her confession and the burden she had carried for most of her long life. You've done the right thing, telling me this. I promise you, I'll find out what really happened to Edmund and Catherine Blackwood. As he left the nursing home, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the parking lot. Daniel sat in his car for several minutes, processing everything Eliza had told him. If what she said was true, then the photograph had indeed captured something sinister. The face of a murderess, smiling at the funeral of her victim. And somewhere at Thornfield Estate, buried beneath a white rose bush, might be the evidence that could prove it. 70 years too late for justice, perhaps, but not too late for truth. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, scenarios playing out as he tried to piece together the full story of what had happened at Thornfield Estate in those autumn days of 1902. He paced the living room, smoking cigarette after cigarette, much to Margaret's concern. The living room was cast in shadows, illuminated only by a single lamp. Outside, occasional car headlights swept across the window, briefly illuminating Daniel's restless figure before plunging him back into semi-darkness. The ashtray on the coffee table filled steadily with cigarette butts as the night wore on. "What are you going to do?" Margaret asked, watching him from the doorway in her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her voice was soft with concern, but there was an edge to it. Worry, perhaps, or the beginning of frustration with his growing obsession. Report a 70-year-old murder to the police? Daniel paused in his pacing, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse from smoking and lack of sleep. "But I can't just ignore this. If Edmund Blackwood was murdered, and possibly Catherine as well, don't they deserve justice even after all this time? And how exactly do you plan to prove any of this? The word of an elderly woman who may be confusing reality with fiction? A photograph that shows a smile that could be explained in countless ways? Margaret moved further into the room, sitting on the edge of the sofa. Daniel, I'm worried about you. You've barely slept. You've hardly eaten. This case from the past is consuming you. The vial, Daniel said suddenly, as if he hadn't heard her concerns. If it's still there, after 70 years? Daniel, be reasonable. Even if Eliza's story is true, even if she did bury something, the chances of it still being there, still being intact enough to provide any kind of evidence. But Daniel wasn't listening. He was already formulating a plan, his mind racing ahead to how he might find the rose bush Eliza had mentioned, how he might search for the vial without being discovered. Thornfield Estate is a museum now, he said, more to himself than to Margaret. Open to the public. I could go there, see the grounds. Maybe find the garden where the rose bush was planted. Margaret sighed, recognizing the determined set of his jaw, the gleam in his eye that meant his course was already decided. Just promise me you won't do anything illegal. Breaking into a historical landmark to dig up the grounds isn't exactly keeping a low profile. Daniel finally seemed to focus on her, his expression softening as he saw the genuine worry in her eyes. He crossed the room and sat beside her, taking her hands in his. I promise I'll be careful. I just need to see for myself. Maybe there's nothing there. Maybe Eliza's memory is playing tricks on her. But I need to know. Margaret studied him for a long moment, then sighed, her shoulders dropping slightly in resignation. 3 days. Then we put this behind us and go back to our normal lives. Daniel nodded, grateful for her understanding, for her patience with what must seem like madness to her practical mind. Margaret had always been his anchor, keeping him grounded when his imagination or enthusiasm threatened to carry him away. It was one of the many reasons he loved her. Her steadiness, her clarity, her ability to see the world as it was rather than as he wished it to be. 3 days, he agreed, pulling her into an embrace. Thank you. The Thornfield estate had changed hands many times since the Blackwoods had lived there. After Vivian's death in 1930, Theodore had sold it, preferring to live in a more modern house in the fashionable part of town. It had been a private residence, then a hospital during World War II, then had stood empty for years before finally being purchased by the Historical Society in 1965. It was now a museum, preserved as an example of Victorian architecture and open to the public for tours. Daniel waited until the weekend, when Margaret had reluctantly agreed to accompany him on a visit. If you're going to pursue this, I want to be involved, she had said in a tone that brooked no argument. 2 sets of eyes are better than one, and someone needs to make sure you don't get carried away. The day was bright and crisp, autumn leaves crunching beneath their feet as they approached the imposing stone facade of Thornfield Estate. The building looked much as it had in old photographs, its Gothic Revival architecture a testament to Victorian wealth and aesthetic sensibilities. Pointed arches, decorative stonework, tall mullioned windows that seemed to watch visitors with an assessing gaze. A small queue of visitors had formed at the entrance, mostly retired couples and a few families with children who looked bored already. Daniel and Margaret joined them, paying the modest entrance fee to the woman at the ticket booth, who smiled brightly as she handed them a pamphlet about the house's history. The next tour begins in 5 minutes, she informed them. Please wait in the entrance hall and your guide will meet you there. The entrance hall was impressive, with a sweeping staircase and wood-paneled walls hung with portraits of long-dead aristocrats who had no connection to the Blackwoods but looked appropriately grand for a house museum. The tour group consisted of about a dozen people, who were soon greeted by a young woman in a prim outfit that was meant to suggest, but not accurately replicate, Victorian servant's attire. Welcome to Thornfield Estate, she began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had given the same speech hundreds of times. My name is Rebecca, and I'll be your guide today. Please stay with the group at all times and remember that photography is allowed but no flash, as it can damage the delicate fabrics and artworks. They joined a small group of tourists being led through the grand rooms by a guide who recited the history of the estate with practiced ease. Daniel listened with half an ear, his eyes scanning the rooms, trying to orient himself based on what Eliza had told him. The tour moved slowly through the house, from the formal drawing room with its ornate plasterwork ceiling and heavy velvet drapes, to the dining room where a massive mahogany table was set with fine china and crystal as if awaiting guests, to the library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that had likely never been read. Rebecca explained the furnishings, the architectural features, the lifestyle of the wealthy during the Victorian and Edwardian periods, but mentioned the Blackwoods only in passing, as one of several families who had owned the estate. Daniel took advantage of a pause in the tour to ask a question. The pamphlet mentions that the Blackwoods owned Thornfield from 1875 to 1930. Were they the ones who added the East Wing? Rebecca smiled, pleased by the question. Yes, indeed. Edmund Blackwood commissioned the East Wing in 1895. It included additional guest rooms and a conservatory, which we'll see later. The Blackwoods were known for their lavish entertaining. And is the study preserved as it was during Edmund's time? Daniel asked, his voice casual, though his heart was beating faster. We've tried to maintain it as authentically as possible, Rebecca replied, though of course many of the original furnishings were sold when the estate changed hands. What you'll see is period appropriate, if not always original to the house. When they reached the study where Edmund Blackwood had died, Daniel felt a strange sensation, as if the air had suddenly grown colder. The room had been preserved much as it must have been in 1902. A massive desk of polished mahogany dominating one wall, leather-bound books lining the walls, a globe in one corner, and a decanter of what would have been brandy on a small table. A Persian carpet in deep reds and blues covered most of the floor, and heavy curtains framed tall windows that overlooked the garden. It was in this room that Edmund Blackwood, the last of the family to own the estate, passed away in 1902, the guide was saying. His death marked the end of an era for Blackwood Vale. How did he die? Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The guide smiled, evidently pleased by the interest. Heart failure, according to records. Not uncommon for men of his age and position. The pressures of business, combined with the rich diet and sedentary lifestyle of the upper classes, made heart ailments quite prevalent. She gestured to a portrait above the fireplace, showing a stern-looking man with a full beard and penetrating eyes. That's Edmund Blackwood, painted in 1900, just 2 years before his death. The Blackwoods sold the estate shortly after his death, and it changed hands several times before being purchased by the Historical Society in 1965. Daniel studied the portrait, searching for some clue in the painted face. Edmund Blackwood looked formidable, but there was a softness around the eyes that suggested kindness beneath the stern exterior. Was this the man who had refused to exploit his workers, who had read poetry with his daughter, who had possibly been murdered by his own wife? Margaret touched his arm, bringing him back to the present. The tour was moving on, and they followed, Daniel casting one last glance at the study where a man had died and a mystery had begun. As the tour continued into the garden, Daniel fell behind, his eyes searching for the white rose bush Eliza had mentioned. The gardens had been maintained in the historical style, with formal beds of flowers and precisely trimmed hedges. Gravel paths wound between box hedges and ornamental shrubs, leading to a small ornamental lake at the far end of the property, and there, near what would have been the servants' quarters, he spotted a rose bush with pale blooms. "Margaret," he whispered, gesturing discreetly. "I think that's it." They waited until the tour had moved on to another part of the garden before approaching the bush. It was set apart from the main flower beds, in a small secluded area that might once have been a private retreat. The roses were not pure white, but a soft, creamy ivory, their fragrance delicate and sweet in the autumn air. Daniel looked around to ensure they weren't being observed, then knelt, pretending to admire the flowers while his hands began to dig discreetly at the base of the plant. The soil was soft from recent rain, yielding easily to his fingers. "This is trespassing," Margaret hissed, keeping watch for any approaching tour guides or security staff. "Probably destruction of property, too. If we're caught, just keep watch," Daniel replied, his fingers now black with soil as he dug deeper. The rose bush was old, its stems thick and gnarled at the base, suggesting it had indeed been here for many decades. Could it be the same one Catherine had planted, that Eliza had buried the vial beneath? It seemed almost too fortunate that it would have survived all the changes of ownership, the neglect during the years the estate stood empty, the renovations when it became a museum. Yet as his fingers worked the soil, he felt a surge of hope. What if it was still here? What if this physical piece of evidence had survived, waiting to be discovered, to confirm the story that the photograph had begun to tell? "Daniel," Margaret warned, her voice tight with anxiety. "Someone's coming. We need to go." He dug faster, more desperately, no longer concerned with being discreet. His knuckles struck something hard, not a stone, but something smooth, man-made. "I found something," he whispered excitedly, working his fingers around the object, careful not to damage it as he extracted it from the earth. Now, Daniel. He had dug down about 6 inches when his knuckles struck something hard. Carefully, he extracted a small object from the earth and wiped away the dirt. His heart pounded in his chest as the soil fell away, revealing what lay beneath. It was a glass vial, sealed with what appeared to be wax, containing a small amount of dark powder. Around the neck of the vial was a faded ribbon, and attached to it, a yellowed tag bearing a single word in delicate handwriting. Evidence. My God, Margaret breathed, her skepticism momentarily forgotten as she stared at the vial in Daniel's hand. The object seemed to pulse with significance, a physical connection to the events of 70 years ago. She really did hide it here. Daniel carefully wrapped the vial in his handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket, his hands trembling slightly with the enormity of what they had found. He quickly pushed the disturbed soil back into place and stood, brushing dirt from his knees as casually as possible. They rejoined the tour group before their absence could be noticed, but Daniel was only half listening to the guide's explanations of the estate's architectural features. His mind was racing with possibilities. The vial in his pocket seemed to burn against his leg, a secret weight demanding attention, demanding justice. What now? Margaret asked as they drove away from the estate, the imposing silhouette of Thornfield receding in the rearview mirror. Her earlier skepticism had been replaced by a grudging fascination, now that tangible evidence had been uncovered. Are you really going to take this to the police? Daniel gripped the steering wheel tightly, the leather creaking under his hands. The road ahead wound through autumn-painted hills, a beautiful landscape that had once witnessed ugly secrets. I need to gather more information first. I want to know exactly what happened to Catherine Blackwood. If she was murdered too, then this goes deeper than we thought. But the vial, shouldn't you have it analyzed to confirm what it contains? Daniel nodded. Yes, but I need someone I can trust. Someone who won't dismiss this as the ravings of a man obsessed with a 70-year-old photograph. He thought for a moment. Jim Russell. He's a detective with the police department. We went to school together, and I've helped him with photographic evidence for cases before. He might listen. Margaret looked out the window, watching the scenery pass. Do you really think anything will come of this? Even if you prove Edmund was poisoned, even if you find out what happened to Catherine, everyone involved is long dead. There's no one left to punish. This isn't about punishment, Daniel said quietly. It's about truth. History is written by the victors, they say. In this case, the victors were Vivian and Theodore Blackwood and Richard Holloway. They wrote the story of Edmund's death, of Catherine's disappearance. They controlled the narrative. His voice took on a new intensity. But the truth was there all along, waiting in that photograph. I want to set the record straight, even after all this time. The next morning, Daniel received a call from Detective Russell. The lab results came back on your vial, Russell said without preamble, his voice low and serious. There was a tension in it that Daniel hadn't heard the day before, a gravity that suggested the detective might be taking the case more seriously now. It contained arsenic mixed with what appears to be powdered sugar, probably to disguise the taste. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles whitening. Arsenic, a common poison in the early 1900s, easily obtained, difficult to detect without specific testing. His mind raced through what he knew about arsenic poisoning. The symptoms could mimic heart failure, especially if administered in small doses over time, gradually weakening the victim until a final fatal dose, which wasn't standard procedure for heart failure deaths in 1902, Russell added, a hint of reluctant interest creeping into his professional tone, especially not for prominent citizens with influential families. So Edmund Blackwood was murdered. Daniel spoke the words slowly, tasting the confirmation of what he had suspected since seeing Vivian's smile in the photograph. It wasn't a question anymore, but a statement of fact. It's consistent with your theory, Russell conceded, though Daniel could hear the reservation in his voice. The arsenic is definitely there, and the combination with sugar suggests deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure. But it still doesn't give us anything actionable. As I said, everyone involved is long dead. What about Catherine? Daniel pressed, unwilling to let the conversation end. He paced the kitchen as he spoke, the phone cord stretching and coiling like a restless snake. Through the window, he could see Margaret in the garden, deadheading the last of the summer roses, her back to the house. I've found evidence suggesting she never left for Switzerland, that the tuberculosis story was a cover-up. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the soft sound of Russell's breathing. the distant clatter of typewriters and voices in the police station background. What kind of evidence? Testimonials from people who knew the family. And think about it, Jim. If Catherine suspected her father was poisoned, if she had evidence, would Vivian and Theodore really let her leave the country? Risk her going to authorities elsewhere? Daniel's voice gained intensity as he laid out his reasoning. They'd want to keep her close, under control, and when that wasn't enough, when she threatened to expose them. You're suggesting they killed her too? Russell's voice was flat, a statement rather than a question. Yes, and I think her body is still on the grounds of the Thornfield estate. Another longer pause. When Russell spoke again, there was a new note in his voice. Not just skepticism now, but concern. Daniel, listen to me. Do not, under any circumstances, start digging up the grounds of a historical landmark. That's a felony. Then help me, officially, open an investigation. Into a 70-year-old case with no living suspects or witnesses? My captain would laugh me out of his office. Russell sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of bureaucratic reality. Look, I believe you might be onto something. The arsenic in the vial, the timing of events, the suspicious remarriage. It all fits a pattern, but my hands are tied by procedure and practicality. After hanging up, Daniel sat in his kitchen, staring at the enhanced photograph of Vivian Blackwood's smiling face. The image that had started it all, the moment of unguarded truth captured by his grandfather's camera. He studied it with a photographer's eye, noting the quality of light, the composition, the details his enhancement had brought out. His grandfather had been skilled, positioning himself to capture the funeral party as they emerged from the church, using the morning light to illuminate their faces despite the customary veils and hats of mourning attire. In the background, partially obscured by other mourners, Daniel could make out the figure of a young man, slim, watchful, standing slightly apart from the main group. Could that be his grandfather, Henry Hayes, who had set up the camera with a timer, then moved into position to observe the scene? Or perhaps an assistant who had operated the shutter. There had to be a way to find the truth, to uncover what had really happened to Catherine. The vial had been where Eliza said it would be, proving that at least part of her story was true. If Catherine had never left for Switzerland, there might be evidence of that fact in the estate's records, staff logs, correspondence, financial documents. The historical society that maintained the Thornfield estate likely had archives of such materials, preserved for their historical value. Daniel spent the next day at the Historical Society's archives, housed in a small building adjacent to the town library. The building was Victorian, like much of the town, with high ceilings and tall, narrow windows that let in streams of autumn sunshine. Inside, the air was cool and slightly musty, laden with the unmistakable scent of old paper and leather bindings. He introduced himself as a researcher working on a book about prominent families of the region, a half-truth that gained him access to the Blackwood records. The archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pembroke, seemed pleased by his interest, mentioning that few people researched the Blackwoods these days. Most visitors are interested in the architectural aspects of Thornfield Estate, not its former occupants, she explained as she led him to a room where several boxes of materials had been set out on a large table. But the Blackwoods were quite influential in their day. Their papers might shed light on the early industrial development of the region. The collection was vast. Ledgers, letters, photographs, diaries, spanning the family's century-long residence at Thornfield. The materials were organized chronologically, stored in acid-free boxes and folders designed to preserve the delicate documents. Daniel focused on the period immediately following Edmund's death, searching for any mention of Catherine's departure for Switzerland. "Let me know if you need anything else," Mrs. Pembroke said, leaving him to his research. "I'll be at the front desk. These materials are quite fragile, so please use the cotton gloves provided and handle everything with care." Daniel nodded, already slipping on the thin white gloves that would protect the documents from the oils in his skin. As the archivist departed, he began his methodical search, starting with the household accounts from October 1902, the month of Edmund's death. Hours passed as he carefully examined document after document. There were household accounts showing payments to staff, cooks, maids, gardeners, a butler, a housekeeper, all meticulously recorded in flowing script. Invoices from suppliers of everything from coal to champagne. Social correspondence. Invitations to dinners and events. Most declined with notes expressing the family's period of mourning. Mundane details of a wealthy family's existence, but nothing about Catherine's education abroad, No receipts for travel arrangements, no letters from Switzerland. It was as if Catherine had simply vanished from the record after her father's funeral. The afternoon light was fading, shadows lengthening across the research room, when Daniel discovered a small, leather-bound book tucked between larger ledgers. Unlike the formal business documents and correspondence, this was personal, intimate, a diary. The flyleaf was inscribed in a delicate feminine hand, property of Catherine Blackwood. With trembling hands, Daniel opened it. The diary was small, designed to be carried in a pocket or purse, its pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. The entries began in January 1902, 9 months before Edmund's death. Catherine's handwriting was delicate, refined, the words of a well-educated young woman recording her thoughts and observations. Most entries were ordinary, descriptions of social events, books she had read, her studies with a private tutor, occasional frustrations with her mother's coldness or her brother's increasingly harsh attitudes. As January gave way to spring and summer, Daniel noted Catherine's growing concern about tensions between her father and brother. An entry from July mentioned another dreadful row between father and Theodore about the mill. Theodore wants to cut wages again, but father refuses. He says the workers can barely feed their families as it is. Theodore called him a sentimental fool who doesn't understand business. In September, Catherine wrote about her worry for her father's health. Father seems tired lately, weaker than usual. Mother says it's just age and the stress of business, but I wonder. She watches him so strangely at dinner, and I've noticed her speaking with Mr. Holloway more frequently than seems proper. But as Daniel flipped forward to October, the tone changed dramatically, from the observations of a sheltered young woman to the growing panic of someone who suspects a terrible crime. October 15th, 1902. Father is dead. They say his heart failed, but I do not believe it. He was in perfect health yesterday, laughing as he showed me the new book of poetry he had ordered from London. I saw Mother with Mr. Holloway in the garden last night, speaking in hushed tones. They did not know I was there. She gave him something, a small packet. When I asked her about it this morning, she struck me for the first time in my life. October 17th, 1902. The funeral was a grotesque spectacle. Mother barely concealed her relief, and Theodore stood like a king surveying his new domain. Only I truly mourned. Father's friend, Dr. Collins, performed the examination, but so hastily. When I suggested a more thorough investigation, Theodore told me I was hysterical with grief, that I should be sent away to recover. Mother agreed too quickly. October 20th, 1902. They are sending me to Switzerland, to a finishing school I have never heard of. I am to leave in 3 days. Mother says it will be good for me, that I need a change of scene after Father's death, but her eyes are cold when she speaks of it. And this morning, I overheard her speaking with Theodore. She suspects, Theodore said. We cannot risk her speaking to anyone. Mother replied, it's arranged. Once she's gone, she won't trouble us again. They mean to be rid of me, as they were rid of Father, but I will not go so easily. I have spoken to Eliza, who has agreed to help me. I have proof now, a sample of the same poison they used on Father. If anything happens to me, she will ensure it reaches the authorities. The diary ended there. No more entries, no account of a plan executed or thwarted, just silence. Daniel sat back, his heart pounding. The diary confirmed his suspicions. Edmund had been poisoned by Vivian and Richard Holloway, with Theodore's complicity. Catherine had known and had planned to expose them. But what had happened next? Had she attempted to flee? Had she been caught? As the shadows lengthened across the archive room, Daniel knew he was running out of time. The Historical Society would be closing soon, and he had barely scratched the surface of the available materials. Making a split-second decision, he carefully photographed each page of the diary with the camera he had brought. Then, after a moment's hesitation, slipped the small book into his pocket. It was theft, he knew, and part of him recoiled from the act. But this wasn't just a historical document. It was evidence of a crime, testimony from a victim who had been silenced. If he left it here, who knew if he would ever see it again, or if someone might remove it once they realized what it contained. Just as he tucked the diary away, Mrs. Pembroke appeared at the door. We'll be closing in 5 minutes, Mr. Hayes. Did you find what you were looking for? Daniel composed his features, hoping his guilt wasn't written across his face. Yes, thank you. The Blackwood papers are fascinating. I may need to return tomorrow for further research if that's possible. Of course, Mrs. Pembroke replied with a professional smile. We're open from 10 to 4. Just sign in at the front desk. Daniel thanked her and gathered his notes, trying to appear casual despite the stolen diary burning in his pocket like a coal. As he left the building, the early evening air cool against his face, he couldn't help glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to be called back, accused, the diary discovered missing. But there was only the quiet of the small-town evening, the distant sound of traffic, the call of birds settling for the night. As Daniel drove home, an idea formed. If Catherine had tried to escape with Eliza's help, perhaps Eliza knew more than she had initially revealed. He needed to speak with her again, to ask about those final days before Catherine's supposed departure. His mind raced ahead, formulating questions, scenarios, possible revelations. The diary had confirmed what he had begun to suspect from the photograph and Eliza's testimony. A conspiracy to murder Edmund Blackwood, a plan discovered by Catherine, who had then become a target herself. But there were still missing pieces, still parts of the story hidden in the past. By the time he reached home, darkness had fallen completely, the streets illuminated by the yellow glow of street lamps. The house was welcoming, warm light spilling from the windows, the smell of dinner greeting him as he opened the door. "Daniel," Margaret called from the kitchen. "Is that you?" "Yes," he replied, removing his coat and hanging it carefully, conscious of the diary in the pocket. "Sorry I'm late. I got caught up at the archives." Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Did you find anything interesting?" Daniel hesitated, torn between his impulse to share everything with her and his reluctance to involve her in what was now technically a crime. The theft of the diary, however justified he felt it was, crossed a line he had never expected to cross. "Some promising leads," he said finally. "I'll tell you over dinner." The next morning, Daniel returned to Meadowbrook Nursing Home, only to be met with devastating news. The day was gray, rain threatening but not yet falling, the sky heavy with clouds that matched Daniel's mood as he approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Eliza Foster," he told the receptionist, a young woman with a kind smile and tired eyes. The smile faltered, replaced by a professional expression of sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," the nurse at the reception desk told him, her voice gentle. "Eliza Foster passed away last night in her sleep." Daniel felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him, a sudden vertigo that had nothing to do with physical balance. "Last night? But she seemed relatively well when I spoke with her." The receptionist nodded, her expression sympathetic but not surprised. "At her age, it's never unexpected. She was 94 after all. The doctor said it was peaceful, in her sleep." She reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Were you a relative?" "No," Daniel replied, still trying to process the news. "Just researching family history. She was very helpful." "I'm sorry for your loss," the nurse said automatically, already turning to answer a ringing phone. Daniel stood there for a moment, feeling strangely bereft. Eliza had been his link to the past, to the events of 1902. With her gone, a crucial witness was lost, a voice silenced just as it had begun to speak the truth after decades of silence. As he turned to leave, a thought struck him. Was anyone with her? Did she have any visitors yesterday? I'd have to check the log. The nurse frowned slightly at the unusual question, but consulted a binder on her desk. Yes, her nephew visited in the afternoon, stayed about an hour. Nephew? Did you get his name? The nurse's frown deepened, clearly wondering why this information mattered to someone who wasn't family. I'd have to check the log. She turned a page in the binder, running her finger down a column of entries. James Holloway. The nurse looked up. Do you know him? Daniel's blood ran cold. Holloway? Are you sure that was the name? Yes, quite sure. He's been visiting her regularly for years. Such a devoted nephew. Daniel thanked the nurse and left quickly, his mind reeling. James Holloway. Could he be related to Richard Holloway, Vivian's second husband? The timing of Eliza's death, just after Daniel had interviewed her about the Blackwoods, seemed too convenient to be coincidence. In his car, Daniel sat for several minutes, trying to process this new development. If James Holloway was indeed related to Richard, and if he had been visiting Eliza regularly, then he might have overheard Daniel's conversation with her, might have learned that Daniel was investigating Edmund's death, that he knew about the poison vial, and if the Holloways had been willing to kill to protect their secrets 70 years ago. A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he realized that by asking questions, by digging into the past, he might have inadvertently put himself in danger. Daniel drove straight to Detective Russell's office, bypassing the front desk with a wave to the receptionist who knew him from his years as a newspaper photographer. His heart was pounding, his palms slick with sweat on the steering wheel. If James Holloway had killed Eliza, and the timing certainly suggested it, then this was no longer just a historical mystery. It was a current crime, one that the police couldn't ignore. The police station was busier than the previous day, officers moving purposefully through the corridors, phones ringing, the hum of activity that indicated a typical workday in progress. Daniel made his way to Russell's office, dodging a uniformed officer carrying a stack of files, narrowly avoiding a collision with a clerical worker pushing a mail cart. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble as he entered Russell's office, not bothering to knock. "Eliza Foster is dead." Russell looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from annoyance at the interruption to concern at Daniel's agitated state. The detective was in his shirt sleeves, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, the look of a man in the middle of a long day. Coffee cups littered his desk, evidence of the fuel that kept him going through the demands of police work. "The woman from the nursing home? Your witness?" Russell set down his pen, giving Daniel his full attention now. "Yes. She died last night, just hours after I found Catherine's diary confirming that Edmund was poisoned." Daniel paced the small office, unable to contain his energy, his growing sense that events were accelerating beyond his control. The office was cramped, barely large enough for Russell's desk and two chairs with filing cabinets lining one wall and a window overlooking the police station parking lot. The walls were adorned with commendations, a calendar, and a bulletin board covered with notices and photographs related to current cases. And guess who visited her yesterday afternoon? A man named James Holloway, supposedly her nephew. Russell frowned. Holloway, as in Richard Holloway, the business partner? Exactly. Daniel stopped pacing and leaned on Russell's desk, his voice intense. "Too much of a coincidence, don't you think? Eliza tells me about the poisoning. I find Catherine's diary confirming it, and suddenly Eliza dies after a visit from a Holloway." "Slow down," Russell said, gesturing for Daniel to take a seat. His voice was calm, a counterpoint to Daniel's agitation, the practiced tone of someone used to dealing with people in states of high emotion. "You're jumping to conclusions. Eliza was 94. People that age die all the time, without any nefarious assistance. But the timing could be coincidental, and this James Holloway could be completely unrelated to Richard, or could be a legitimate relative of Eliza's who's been visiting her for years, just as the nurse said." Russell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "Now tell me about this diary." Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. The detective was right. He was making connections based on limited information, seeing patterns that might not exist. It was the same tendency that made him a good photographer, but could lead him astray in an investigation like this. He removed Catherine's diary from his pocket and placed it on Russell's desk. "I found this at the Historical Society archives. It belonged to Catherine Blackwood." Russell picked up the small volume, handling it carefully. "And you borrowed it?" His tone made it clear he recognized the theft for what it was. Daniel had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I thought it would be safer with me. It contains Catherine's account of her suspicions about her father's death, her fear that she would be the next target." He showed Russell the photographs he had taken of Catherine's diary entries, explaining where he had found the book and what it revealed. The detective read through them carefully, his expression thoughtful, the professional skepticism gradually giving way to reluctant interest. "October 20th was the last entry," Daniel pointed out. "She was supposed to leave for Switzerland 3 days later on the 23rd, but according to local records there's no evidence she ever left Blackwood Vale. No travel receipts, no correspondence from abroad." Russell studied the images thoughtfully, his detective's mind working through the implications, evaluating the evidence with professional detachment. "It's certainly suggestive," he admitted, setting the photographs aside. "The diary entries align with what Eliza told you, and with the arsenic in the vial, but still circumstantial. A frightened young woman's suspicions don't prove murder. Combined with the arsenic in the vial and Eliza's testimony, it builds a compelling case." Daniel leaned forward, his voice intense. "And now Eliza's death, immediately after she spoke to me. Can you at least look into that? Check if this James Holloway is related to Richard? Find out if there was anything suspicious about how Eliza died?" Russell considered for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I can make some inquiries. Check Holloway's background. Talk to the nursing home staff. If there's any indication of foul play in Eliza's death, we'll investigate. He fixed Daniel with a stern look. But I need you to step back. Let me handle this. No more amateur detective work. No more stealing historical documents. No more confronting potential suspects. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Russell was right. If James Holloway had indeed killed Eliza, then he was dangerous. And Daniel was a photographer, not a trained investigator. He had already crossed ethical and legal lines in his pursuit of the truth. Going further could put both himself and the case in jeopardy. All right, he agreed reluctantly. I'll let you handle it, but keep me informed. As much as I can, Russell promised. Now, I need to get back to work, and you need to go home and let the professionals take over. Daniel left the police station with mixed feelings. On one hand, Russell had agreed to investigate James Holloway and Eliza's death, a step forward in bringing the truth to light. On the other hand, he was now expected to step aside, to wait passively, while others pursued the investigation he had initiated. It went against his nature, his need to see things through to their conclusion. Outside, the threatened rain had begun to fall, a fine mist that beaded on his jacket and dampened his hair. The world seemed muted, colors dulled by the gray light, sounds softened by the gentle patter of raindrops. It matched Daniel's mood, uncertain, suspended between action and patience. Despite his promise to Russell, Daniel spent the rest of the day researching James Holloway, using the newspaper's archives and contacts. The newspaper office was a familiar environment, a place where he had spent countless hours over the years. The newsroom was quieter than it had been in previous decades, with fewer reporters and more empty desks, a sign of the changing times for print journalism. But it still had the energy of a place where information was currency, where stories were shaped from raw facts into narratives that informed the public. Daniel's colleagues greeted him with casual familiarity, not questioning his presence at the archives or his interest in the Holloway family. As a staff photographer, he had access to the paper's extensive records, accumulated over more than a century of publishing. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. James Holloway was indeed Richard Holloway's grandson, born in 1925 to Richard's son from his first marriage. According to the society pages, he had been a fixture at local events since the 1950s, described as a prominent businessman continuing the Holloway family tradition of civic engagement. After Richard's death in 1940, James had inherited a substantial fortune and had continued the family's influence in Blackwood Vale, though more discreetly than his grandfather. Most interestingly, James served on the board of the historical society that maintained the Thornfield estate. He would have access to all the archives, would know about any discoveries Daniel might have made there, would know about Catherine's diary. The realization sent a chill through Daniel. If James was determined to keep his family's secrets buried, he would soon discover that the diary was missing. Would he connect that to Daniel's visit to the archives? Would he realize that the photographer who had been asking questions about the Blackwoods now possessed written evidence of a 70-year-old murder conspiracy? The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the newsroom windows, turning the streetlights into blurred halos in the gathering dusk. Daniel stared at a photograph of James Holloway from a Society page article. An elderly but distinguished-looking man with silver hair and a patrician bearing, cutting the ribbon at the opening of a new wing of the local hospital. The Holloway name was on a plaque beside him, recognition of a substantial donation. The man in the photograph looked benevolent, civic-minded, a pillar of the community. But if Daniel's suspicions were correct, he was also someone willing to kill to protect his family's dark legacy. "Margaret," Daniel said when his wife answered, "I need you to listen carefully. I won't be home tonight. I'm going back to Thornfield." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Margaret's voice, tight with concern. "Daniel, no. We agreed. Eliza is dead, Margaret. She died last night after being visited by Richard Holloway's grandson. The same night I found Catherine's diary confirming she suspected her father was poisoned." There was silence on the other end of the line, the connection filled with the static of falling rain and unspoken fears. Then, "You think this Holloway killed Eliza? That's a serious accusation, Daniel." "I don't know for certain, but it's too much of a coincidence." Daniel lowered his voice, though he was alone in the archive room, surrounded by filing cabinets and bound volumes of yellowing newspapers. "I believe Catherine's body is somewhere on the estate grounds. I'm going to find it tonight." "This is insane. You're talking about breaking into a historical landmark at night to look for a 70-year-old body, based on a hunch. Based on evidence, Margaret, Catherine's diary, Eliza's testimony, the vial of poison, the suspicious timing of Eliza's death, it all points to the same conclusion. Catherine discovered her father was poisoned, threatened to expose the truth, and was killed to keep her silent. He could almost see Margaret's expression, the furrow between her brows, the tightening of her lips, the worry in her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but firm. If you really believe this, then go to Russell. Let the police handle it. Russell's hands are tied by procedure. He needs hard evidence, and the only way to get that is to find Catherine's body. Daniel checked his watch. The Historical Society would be closed by now, the estate grounds deserted except for a night watchman. I have to go. I'll call you tomorrow morning. Daniel, I love you, he said quickly, then hung up before she could say more, before her concern could weaken his resolve. As dusk fell, Daniel drove to a spot about half a mile from the Thornfield estate, parking his car on a secluded side road where it wouldn't attract attention. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, but had left the ground soft and muddy. In his backpack were a flashlight, a small shovel, a camera with film, and Catherine's diary, which might help guide his search. He felt a twinge of guilt for disobeying Russell's direct instruction to stay out of the investigation, but pushed it aside. This was too important to leave to procedure and official channels. The weight of the backpack felt like a physical manifestation of the burden he had taken on, the responsibility to uncover the truth, to bring justice to those who had been silenced. It pressed against his shoulders as he made his way through the gathering darkness, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The estate grounds were dark, the main building illuminated only by a few security lights that cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. A crescent moon occasionally emerged from behind the clouds, providing brief moments of silvery illumination before being swallowed again by darkness. Daniel skirted the perimeter, avoiding the gravel paths that might betray his presence with crunching footsteps. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the garden where he had found the vial. Every sound seemed amplified, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, the soft squish of mud beneath his boots. If Catherine had been killed on the estate, where would they have hidden her body? It would need to be somewhere unlikely to be discovered, even as the property changed hands over the decades. Not the formal gardens, which would be regularly maintained. Not inside the house, where renovations might expose remains. Daniel's thoughts turned to the old groundskeeper's cottage, a small stone building at the edge of the estate that had been mentioned in the Historical Society's records as being demolished in 1925. If a body had been buried there, and the building later razed and the area left unused. He made his way carefully through overgrown shrubs to where the cottage had once stood. The vegetation was dense here, at the edge of the formal gardens where the manicured landscape gave way to a more natural setting. Briars caught at his clothing, and low-hanging branches, heavy with raindrops, brushed his face with cold, wet fingers. Now there was only a small clearing, surrounded by trees, the foundation stones still visible in places beneath the encroaching vegetation. The cottage had been modest, according to the historical records, a simple dwelling for the estate's gardener and groundskeeper, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, a kitchen garden to one side. Nothing remained now except these scattered stones, half buried in earth and moss, and the faint outline of what had once been a structure. Daniel switched on his flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid detection from the main house or by any security personnel who might be patrolling the grounds. The yellow light cut through the darkness, revealing a small, open area approximately 20 feet square, a manageable space to search. But where exactly should he dig? He needed some indication, some disturbance in the natural pattern of growth that might suggest where the earth had been turned decades ago. He moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, studying the vegetation, looking for any anomaly in the distribution of plants or in the contours of the ground. As he swept the flashlight beam across the clearing, Daniel noticed an area where the vegetation was slightly different, younger, less established than the surrounding plants. It was a subtle difference, one that might go unnoticed by someone not specifically looking for it. But to Daniel's searching eyes, it stood out like a signpost. Could this be a spot that had been disturbed more recently than the cottage's demolition? He began to dig, carefully at first, then with increasing urgency as the minutes ticked by. The soil was hard-packed on the surface, a crust formed by decades of rain and sun, but beneath it was looser, more friable. His shovel cut through roots and stones, each impact sending vibrations up his arms. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air, and his breath came in short gasps as he worked. The hole deepened. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3. His back ached, his hands blistered inside his gloves, but he persevered, driven by a conviction that he was close to the truth, to the final piece of the puzzle that had begun with a smile in a funeral photograph. At 3 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. Not the dull thud of stone or the springy resistance of a root, but a hollow sound, like wood. Daniel fell to his knees, using his hands to brush away the remaining soil. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of anticipation and dread. What if he had found Catherine's remains after all these years? What if the final confirmation of his theory was about to be revealed in this lonely clearing? What he uncovered made his breath catch in his throat. A small wooden box, about the size of a child's coffin, but too small to contain an adult's body. The wood was rotted in places, blackened with age and damp, but had been preserved surprisingly well beneath the soil. The metal hinges and clasp were corroded but still intact, a testament to the quality of their craftsmanship. With trembling hands he lifted the box, surprised by its lightness. It wasn't large enough to contain a body. Setting it on the ground beside the hole, he pried open the rotting lid, the wood creaking in protest as it gave way to his efforts. Inside was not Catherine's remains, but something perhaps more valuable: a leather-bound journal, several bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small metal box. The items were remarkably well preserved, protected from the elements by the wooden box and the earth that had covered it. Daniel opened the journal first, holding it close to the flashlight, its pages crackling slightly as he turned them. The paper yellowed but still intact, the ink faded but legible. His hands shook with excitement and disbelief. Property of Catherine Blackwood, October 22, 1902, read the inscription on the first page. Daniel flipped through the journal, reading entries that told a horrifying tale. Catherine had indeed discovered that her father had been poisoned. She had confronted her mother and Theodore, threatening to go to the authorities with her evidence. They had locked her in her room, planning to send her away where she could be quietly disposed of. But Catherine had escaped with Eliza's help. She had hidden on the estate in the groundskeeper's cottage, compiling evidence against her family. The journal detailed how she had witnessed Richard Holloway and her mother discussing her father's death, admitting their crime when they thought no one could hear. Each entry revealed more of the conspiracy, more details of the plot that had ended Edmund Blackwood's life. Catherine's writing grew increasingly desperate, her fear palpable in the hurried script, the occasional ink blot where her pen had lingered too long as she gathered her thoughts. The last entry was dated November 15, 1902. They have discovered my hiding place. Theodore came with Mr. Holloway's men. I heard them outside. There is no escape. If you are reading this, know that Edmund Blackwood was murdered by his wife Vivian, his business partner Richard Holloway, and with the knowledge and complicity of his son Theodore. I, Catherine Blackwood, am the only witness to their crime, and I fear I shall soon join my father in death. I have hidden all evidence in this box, which Eliza will bury if I do not return. May justice find them, no matter how many years may pass. The journal ended there. Daniel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the weight of Catherine's words reaching out to him across 7 decades. Her voice, preserved in ink and paper, spoke directly to him from the past. A desperate plea for justice, a truth buried but not forgotten. But if this box contained her evidence, where was Catherine herself? His question was answered as he examined the bundles of letters. With careful fingers, he untied the faded ribbon around the first bundle, the silk crumbling slightly at his touch, and unfolded the topmost letter. They were correspondence between Richard Holloway and various officials, spanning the years 1902 to 1904. The papers were formal, typed on letterhead, with signatures in fading ink at the bottom. One letter, from a doctor at a private asylum in another state, confirmed receipt of a special patient to be kept in isolation and registered under a false name. The language was clinical but chilling. We understand the delicate nature of the situation and assure you that the young lady will receive the treatment her condition requires with the utmost discretion. Another, dated 2 years later, clinically reported the death of this patient from complications arising from treatment. Now, the letter expressed condolences in perfunctory language, assuring Mr. Holloway that all arrangements were handled as per your instructions, with no record of the patient's true identity preserved. Catherine hadn't been killed outright. She had been imprisoned in an asylum, where she had eventually died, alone and under a false identity. A fate perhaps more cruel than a quick death. Isolated, probably drugged, her desperate attempts to tell the truth dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. Daniel felt a profound sadness wash over him. Catherine had been brave, determined to expose her family's crime, despite the danger to herself, and she had paid the ultimate price for that courage. The metal box contained the final piece of evidence, a small bottle of clear liquid labeled sedative, along with a handwritten note in what appeared to be Richard Holloway's handwriting, instructing Theodore on the proper dosage to render Edmund unconscious before administering the arsenic. Daniel carefully repacked everything into the wooden box. This was the evidence he needed, concrete proof of a conspiracy to murder, documented in the conspirators' own words. Even after 70 years, this would be impossible to dismiss. The letters, the sedative bottle, the detailed instructions, all physical evidence of a crime that had been carefully concealed behind a facade of respectability. As he stood lifting the box, a voice spoke from the darkness behind him. "I was wondering if anyone would ever find that." Daniel whirled around, the flashlight beam illuminating an elderly man in an expensive overcoat, his white hair neatly combed, his posture still straight despite his advanced years. He stood at the edge of the clearing, partially in shadow, but Daniel could make out patrician features that matched the newspaper photographs he had seen earlier that day. In his hand was a revolver, pointed steadily at Daniel's chest. The gun was an antique, a family heirloom perhaps, but clearly maintained and functional. It gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, the polished wood grip and blued steel barrel speaking of care and regular use. There was no tremor in the hand that held it, no hesitation in how it was aimed directly at Daniel's heart. "Mr. Holloway, I presume," Daniel said, striving to keep his voice steady despite the fear that surged through him at the sight of the weapon. His mind raced, calculating distances, possible moves, the chance of escape or disarming the older man. The man inclined his head slightly, a courtly gesture at odds with the threat of the gun. "James Holloway, yes, and you would be Daniel Hayes, the photographer who's been asking entirely too many questions about my family." His voice was cultured, pleasant even, with the measured cadences of someone accustomed to being listened to. It was the voice of privilege, of authority, and now, of menace. "Your grandfather was a murderer," Daniel said, clutching the box tightly, as if it might shield him from the bullet that could end his life at any moment. Rain had begun to fall again, gentle drops pattering on the leaves around them, running down Daniel's face like cold tears. He helped kill Edmund Blackwood and imprisoned Catherine in an asylum where she died. "Ancient history," Holloway replied dismissively, his free hand making a brushing motion, as if sweeping away Daniel's accusations like so much dust. "Water under the bridge. Or it would have been, if you hadn't insisted on dredging it all up again." A flash of lightning illuminated the clearing briefly, followed seconds later by a low rumble of thunder. The storm was intensifying, but neither man moved, locked in their confrontation amid the ruins of the groundskeeper's cottage where Catherine Blackwood had written her final, desperate plea for justice. "Did you kill Eliza Foster?" Daniel asked, his voice rising slightly. He needed to keep Holloway talking, to buy time, to find a way out of this deadly situation. A slight smile crossed Holloway's face, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Eliza was 94 with a heart condition. It took very little encouragement for her heart to finally give out. Just a small adjustment to her medication. He shrugged slightly, as if discussing something trivial, inconsequential. "Just as it will appear that you had a tragic accident while trespassing on historical property." Daniel's mind raced, searching for a way out. "People know I'm here. Detective Russell knows everything I've discovered." "Does he?" "From what I understand, he's been rather reluctant to take your theories seriously. And by the time anyone thinks to connect your disappearance to the Blackwood case, any evidence will have been properly disposed of." Holloway gestured with the gun. "Now, put down the box and step away from it." "I don't think so, James." Both men turned at the new voice. Detective Russell stepped into the clearing, his own weapon drawn and pointed at Holloway. He was soaked from the rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, water dripping from his coat, but his stance was professional, calm, his gun held steady despite the weather. Relief flooded through Daniel at the sight of his friend. "Jim, how did you—" "Later," Russell said curtly, his eyes never leaving Holloway. "Right now, I need Mr. Holloway to drop his weapon." His voice took on the authoritative tone of a police officer in control of a situation. "Slowly, sir." 2 fingers. Place it on the ground. Holloway didn't move, his expression calculating as he assessed the new development. "Detective," he said smoothly, "this man is trespassing on historical society property. I was merely conducting a citizen's arrest." "With a gun?" Russell moved closer, his stance professional, calm, and I couldn't help overhearing what sounded very much like a confession to Eliza Foster's murder, as well as a threat to Mr. Hayes here. Holloway's composure faltered slightly, the aristocratic facade cracking to reveal the desperation beneath. His eyes darted from Russell to Daniel, to the box of evidence, calculating odds, possibilities, escape routes. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is private property. I have jurisdiction wherever a crime is being committed, and threatening someone with a firearm is definitely a crime." Russell nodded to Daniel. "You okay?" "Yes," Daniel replied, relief washing over him in a wave that left him feeling weak-kneed and lightheaded. "How did you know I'd be here?" "Margaret called me, worried sick about you. Said you were planning to dig up the Thornfield estate looking for a body." Russell kept his eyes on Holloway, even as he spoke to Daniel. "I figured you might need some backup, and after I looked into James Holloway, found out he was Richard's grandson, that he served on the Historical Society board, that he'd been visiting Eliza Foster for years despite no actual family connection. I got worried." Holloway's face hardened, the last vestiges of his cordial mask falling away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "You have nothing. No proof of anything except that I caught a trespasser. My family has stood for generations in this town. My word against his. And what about this?" Daniel held up the wooden box. "Catherine Blackwood's journal. Letters between your grandfather and the asylum where he imprisoned her. Detailed instructions for poisoning Edmund Blackwood. It's all here. Evidence that's been buried for 70 years, waiting to be found." Russell reached for his radio with his free hand, his gun never wavering from its aim at Holloway's chest. "This is Detective Russell. I need officers at the Thornfield estate, groundskeeper's cottage area. 1 suspect in custody, armed." As Russell read Holloway his rights and handcuffed him, the elderly man's demeanor changed, the arrogance deflating, leaving only a tired old man who had carried his family's dark secret for decades. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked his age, a frail figure standing in the rain, defeated by a truth he had tried so hard to suppress. Daniel explained what he had found. Not Catherine's body, but her hidden testament to the crimes committed against her father and herself. The rain had intensified, soaking through their clothing, washing away the dirt from the excavation. But Daniel barely noticed, energized by the vindication of his suspicions and the discovery of the evidence that proved them true. "It's all here," he said, opening the box to show Russell the contents, protecting them as best he could from the rain with his body. Catherine's journal detailing the conspiracy, letters proving they had her committed to an asylum under a false name, even the original bottle of sedative they used on Edmund before poisoning him. Russell examined the evidence with growing amazement, holding the flashlight awkwardly while maintaining his grip on Holloway. "This is extraordinary. A 70-year-old murder case documented by the victim herself." He looked up at Daniel, respect evident in his eyes despite the rain dripping from his brows. "You've done what I thought was impossible. You've solved it." In the distance, the wail of police sirens could be heard, growing louder as they approached the estate. Flashlight beams bounced through the trees as officers made their way toward them, guided by Russell's radio directions. James Holloway was arrested that night, charged initially with assault and trespassing, but as the evidence from Catherine's box was examined and authenticated, more serious charges followed: accessory after the fact to murder, obstruction of justice, and eventually, the murder of Eliza Foster, which a thorough autopsy revealed to have been caused by a lethal injection disguised as her regular medication. The story broke in the national press, a sensational tale of murder, conspiracy, and justice long delayed. The photograph that had started it all, Edmund Blackwood's funeral, with Vivian's telling smile revealed by Daniel's enhancement, became iconic, published in newspapers across the country. Thornfield Estate was temporarily closed to the public as investigators thoroughly searched the grounds. They never found Catherine's body. Records from the asylum confirmed she had been buried there in an unmarked grave, but they did discover other evidence that corroborated her account, including traces of arsenic in samples taken from the study where Edmund had died. The case became a national sensation, featured in newspapers and television reports across the country. Reporters flocked to Blackwood Vale, interviewing locals, photographing Thornfield Estate, digging into the town's history. The story had everything: wealth, murder, a decades-old conspiracy, and justice finally served. Daniel found himself at the center of attention, sought after for interviews, offered book deals, praised for his persistence and insight. But for Daniel, the publicity was secondary to the satisfaction of having uncovered the truth, of having given voice to Catherine Blackwood after 70 years of silence. In the spring of 1973, a small ceremony was held at St. Mary's Church Cemetery. The day was bright and clear, with a gentle breeze stirring the new leaves on the trees. Birds sang in the branches, and early flowers bloomed among the gravestones, nature's reminder of renewal and continuance even in a place of endings. A headstone was placed beside Edmund Blackwood's grave, bearing Catherine's name and the dates of her birth and death. It was a symbolic gesture. Her remains had never been found, but an important one, acknowledging her rightful place in the family plot and in the town's history. On it was inscribed, "Truth, though buried, will rise." Daniel stood beside the new grave, Margaret's hand in his, as the priest concluded the service. Detective Russell was there, as were several reporters and curious townspeople. But Daniel's attention was on an elderly woman in a wheelchair, brought to the ceremony by her nurse from another care home. Martha Collins was 91 years old, the daughter of Dr. Collins, who had attended Edmund Blackwood's death. After the case had broken, she had contacted Daniel with one final piece of the puzzle. "My father knew," she had told him in a quavering voice when he had visited her at the nursing home, a place much like the one where Eliza had lived and died. He knew Edmund had been poisoned, but he was afraid. The Blackwoods and Holloways controlled everything in those days. They owned the newspaper, had friends on the police force, donated to every charity in town. Crossing them meant ruin, or worse. She had paused, her rheumy eyes distant with memories. He signed the death certificate saying heart failure, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. He drank himself to death by the time I was 15. Now, as the small crowd dispersed, Martha motioned for Daniel to come closer. Her wheelchair was positioned near the new headstone, where she had placed a small bouquet of white roses, Catherine's favorite, according to her father's recollections. "She can rest now," the old woman whispered, her voice thin but clear in the spring air. "And so can my father. You've given them peace." Daniel nodded, too moved for words. He had set out to solve a mystery, driven by curiosity and a photographer's eye for detail. What he had discovered was not just the truth about a long-ago crime, but a chance for justice and closure for those who had been silenced. As he and Margaret walked back to their car, Daniel glanced back at the cemetery. For a moment, he thought he saw a figure in white standing by Catherine's new headstone, a young woman with delicate features, her face peaceful at last. Then a cloud passed over the sun, casting a brief shadow across the cemetery, and when the light returned, the figure was gone. "What is it?" Margaret asked, noticing his hesitation. She followed his gaze, but saw only gravestones and flowers, the ordinary landscape of a cemetery on a spring morning. Daniel smiled softly. "Nothing, just saying goodbye." In the months that followed, Daniel compiled all the evidence, photographs, and testimonies into a book titled The Widow's Smile, which became a bestseller. The story of Catherine Blackwood, her courage in the face of betrayal, and her 70-year wait for justice, captured the public imagination. James Holloway pled guilty to Eliza's murder, avoiding a trial that would have further exposed the dark history of his family. He died in prison 2 years later, the last link to the conspiracy that had begun with a smile at a funeral and ended with the truth finally brought to light. Thornfield Estate was eventually reopened, with a new exhibit dedicated to the Blackwood family and the events of 1902. The wooden box and its contents, Catherine's journal, the letters, the bottle of sedative, were displayed under glass, along with the enhanced photograph that had started Daniel's investigation. Visitors came from across the country to see the artifacts of a murder that had remained hidden for 7 decades. And it all began with a photograph, a moment frozen in time that, when seen in the right light, revealed the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Sometimes the most revealing truths are found not in what people try to hide, but in what they inadvertently show. In Vivian Blackwood's case, it was a smile, a momentary lapse in her performance of grief, captured forever by the camera's unblinking eye. And sometimes justice comes not in swift, dramatic moments, but in the patient, persistent pursuit of truth across the decades. For Catherine Blackwood, it took 70 years and one curious photographer who noticed a detail others had missed. Next time you look at an old photograph, remember, every face tells a story. The question is whether you're really seeing what's there, or only what you expect to see. In the darkness beyond death, perhaps Catherine Blackwood smiles now, not the cold smile of her mother at Edmund's funeral, but the warm smile of one who has finally been heard, finally been believed, finally been given the justice she sought for so long. And in a small town cemetery, where a headstone bears her name at last, white roses bloom each spring, a living reminder that truth, though it may lie buried for decades, will eventually rise to the light.